area in Germany, of course, to Montgomery, Alabama, where they worked their way up to successful cotton brokers and dry goods merchants before the war. They relocated to New York and started up a brokerage firm. You may have heard of it, Lehman Brothers Brokerage. Mayer worked tirelessly to aid the Alabama Confederate prisoners who were held in Union POW camps. So he was certainly a person of feeling and Rahmanis. Interestingly, his son, Herbert Lehman, became a United States Senator from New York. Herbert was named for his father's attorney. His father's attorney had been a Confederate Colonel, Hillary Herbert, who, interesting, later served as Secretary of the Navy in Grover Cleveland's administration. So there had all these connections and accomplishments. The attorney and author of the book, The Jewish Confederates, Robert Rosen, wrote, they quote, historians of the American Jewish experience reached a consensus long ago. The Jews were more accepted in the antebellum South than in the North. Why? Unlike in New England, the 18th and early 19th century, Puritanism spawned anti-Semitism, whereas in the South, the Southern leadership tended to be Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and Methodists, the most tolerant of the Protestant denominations. And they were cosmopolitan and educated people who appreciated those same qualities in their Jewish neighbors. And the quality of life was enhanced by the presence of Jewish teachers, musicians, lawyers, doctors, innkeepers, druggists, merchants, and men of learning, unquote. But still in all, it was a period in America of anti-Semitism. Well, moving on, Major David Camden de Leon of Charleston, South Carolina, was a career Army officer. He was a hero in the Mexican War, and his old commander, General Winfield Scott, pleaded with de Leon and with many other senior Southern officers to remain in the Federal Army, accept a post in the Northwest frontier, the Northwest then being Michigan and Ohio, today's boundaries are. And the reason for that was so that they wouldn't be in conflict and have to fight against the South. But de Leon refused. He fled south despite threats of arrest and became the Confederates' first Surgeon General. Later, he served as the medical director of the Army of Northern Virginia. And while most Southern Jews did support secession, and a handful even signed the Articles of Succession in their state's delegation, a few opposed it, like Edwin Warren Moise of Charleston, who was living in Columbus, Georgia. And there were some who were reluctant secessionists, simply going along with the majority despite personal reservations. There were several Jews even at the firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, which, of course, as we know, began the war officially in 1861. As the federal troops, you see, there's always a Jewish connection to some of these things, but we don't read them in the history books because these are not facts that are either known, brought out, or considered of historical interest or importance, but they are to us. So as the federal troops were under firebombing, the Confederate general, P.G.T. Beauregard, General Beauregard was a colorful, dashing, he was Cajun from Louisiana. His name was Pierre Gustave de Toussaint Beauregard. Well, Beauregard was concerned that his old instructor at West Point, Major Anderson, who was commanding the fort, would be injured. So Beauregard sent a fireboat to extinguish the blaze under the direction of the Charleston Fire Department chief, who was M.H. Nathan, a prominent member of the Jewish community. And when the fort fell, the palmetto flag of South Carolina was raised by J.L. Deering of the governor's staff and by the controversial Franklin J. Moses Jr., whose father later became Chief Justice of the South Carolina Supreme Court. There was Sir Moses Ezekiel, and I'll say that again, Sir Moses Ezekiel of Richmond. He was too young to enlist, but later fought at the Battle of New Market as a VMI, that's Virginia Military Institute cadet. After the war was over, Robert E. Lee encouraged him to pursue his dream of becoming a sculptor. He later did the Confederate Soldiers Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery, where he himself is also buried. Of interest is that later on, he was knighted for his body of work by the King of Italy. That's where the sir. Corporal Adolf Proskauer rose in rank to major. He fought in several battles, including South Mountain, and that's up in Maryland, Frederick and Hagerstown. And Proskauer was wounded at Antietam in the Sunken Road Bloody Lane battle. He also led the 12th Alabama Infantry at Culp's Hill, one of the key engagement points during the Battle of Gettysburg. The Alabama 12th regimental historian wrote of Proskauer at Gettysburg, quote, "Our gallant Jew major smoked his cigars calmly and coolly in the thickest of the fight," unquote. Popular with his men, he rose in rank, but his rise was impeded by an anti-Semitic colonel, and yet he was promoted. He fought on and was wounded at Chancellorsville a third time. Abraham Charles Mayer, a career soldier and West Point graduate, served in both the Florida Seminole Wars and in the Mexican War, where he was decorated. He became the quartermaster general for the Confederacy. Now, these Jewish guys did very, very well. They were high-ranking people. He married the daughter of Major General David Twiggs and General Twiggs rebuilt a Florida fort. This was before the war against the Indian attacks. The Seminoles were very difficult. And he named that fort in honor of his son-in-law, Fort Myers. So the Florida City, where I know you are surely aware, that's the spring training site for the Red Sox, is named for Abraham Mayer. It's a little interesting historical note. Though opposed to secession, Edwin Warren Moise volunteered and spent $10,000, all of his personal fortune, to outfit 50 of the newly formed Georgia Company of 120 partisan Rangers, named in his honor the Moise Rangers, possibly the only company officially named in honor of a Jewish officer. He served under Cavalry General Wade Hampton. Later in the war, during Reconstruction, he was elected South Carolina Adjutant General in the 1876 election. There were a handful of Confederate Jews who deserted and joined the Union Army out of principle or of self-preservation. Isaac Arnold of Alabama was convicted of desertion and sentenced to execution, but the Reverend Rabbi Max Michelbacher of Richmond intervened, and Arnold's life was spared. The overwhelming reaction in the Southern press and public was the Jews had served the Confederacy nobly and honorably in service and war. But in reality, there were a few exceptions. Galvanized Yankees was the term for Confederate POWs who were recruited into the Union Army. Lewis Wolfe, for example, emigrated from Germany, lived in Savannah just before the war, and fought for the Confederacy for 18 months before being taken prisoner. Then he served in the Union Army. When the war was over, he moved to Massachusetts. When he died, the Lynn, Massachusetts paper, the Lynn Item, called him, quote, a veteran of both sides of the Civil War, unquote. And there were a few Jewish deserters. We have to look at all of the sides of this picture. Bernard Rosenblatt emigrated from Warsaw, lived in Charleston, when he was drafted into the Confederate Army. But then he learned that the South was fighting to uphold slavery. He ran away, enlisted in the 4th New York Heavy Artillery. The New York 4th was an Irish regiment. And Max Newgoss's 2 brothers were in New York, but he came to South Carolina seeking employment, though he had no family there. Still enlisted, was wounded at the 7 Days Battle, and eventually rejoined his unit at Fredericksburg and at Chancellorsville. On the first day of battle at Gettysburg, he deserted, escaped, and was picked up by New York militia and sent as a prisoner to Fort Delaware. He was not pardoned and released until the end of the war. There were a small number of traitors, including Levi Strauss of Lexington, Virginia, who was court-martialed and actually was hanged as a Union spy, which he was. They found plans and maps in his wagon. So this was not anti-Semitism. This was a deserter, a spy. On the other hand, there are happier stories. A Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Spiegel of the 120th Ohio was in occupied Memphis, Tennessee, where he greeted Southern Jewish residents. They invited him to Hanukkah lunch. The boarding house proprietor recognized him from the old country and was shocked to see the son of a German rabbi as a Union lieutenant colonel. Spiegel died at the Red River ambush in Alexandria, Louisiana, but his brother Joseph founded the Spiegel Catalog Company. Now we get to some more fun stuff. Women. Rachel Lala Lyons was born in Columbia, South Carolina, in an observant Jewish home. She studied at the Hebrew Sunday School. During the war, she was a, femme fatale who enchanted Henry Timrod, later the poet laureate of the Confederacy. She wound up marrying Confederate surgeon Dr. James Hustis and moved to Mobile the year after the war. Eliza Moses was only 14, and she wailed for the return of Lieutenant Albert Luria, whom she loved. But he was mortally wounded at Fair Oaks in 1862 at age 19 in the Romeo and Juliet motif. So there was a lot of loss and sadness and death that affected Jews as well as everybody else. Nina Moise of Charleston was a poet and the first well-known Jewish woman in the field of American literature. Her 1833 collection, Fancy's Sketchbook, was the first published book of poetry by an American Jewish woman. She moved to the safety of Sumter, South Carolina from Charleston. She was blind and despondent over the Southern cause. It was Rosanna Osterman of Galveston, Texas. She gave so much time and attention to wounded soldiers that upon her passing in 1866, she was praised in the newspaper for her service. And then there was Bertha Levy, attractive and opinionated. She left Bavaria. Well, that's a bad combination in those days, attractive and opinionated. She left Bavaria because of a radical student politic life at Heidelberg. Fearing her arrest, her parents sent her to live with her uncle in Natchez, Mississippi. There she married Julius Oates from Memphis, but he abhorred slavery and later joined the Union Army. But Bertha and her family were loyal to the South. Again, great motif of the Civil War, families divided, fighting on both sides. In a baby carriage carrying out one of her little sons, she managed to smuggle quinine from Cincinnati to Kentucky to help the beleaguered Confederates. The Union authorities found out, but Julius's record as a loyal officer saved him. So then they moved to occupied Knoxville, where Julius became the unofficial rabbi, and his brother started a newspaper there and later acquired the New York Times. See that name? Ochs, O-C-H-S. That's family still associated with the origin of the New York Times. Then there was Ada Isaacs Menken, who may or may not have been born Jewish. Witty, risque, voluptuous, and a mysterious actress from Louisiana. I don't know, all these characters seem to come from Louisiana, but she became an active Jew after marrying Alexander Menken. Outrageous, she appeared in a flesh-toned body stocking while strapped to a horse. She was active in Jewish causes even after divorcing Menken, a few months after the wedding. In December 1862, she made a public spectacle in Baltimore by loudly supporting the Confederate cause. Arrested for being a secessionist, she refused to leave the South or to take the oath of allegiance. Her notoriety helped her career, but it is believed she had little real connection to the Confederacy or to the war. So, in Robert Rosen's book, I read about Georgia's West Point Guards and Lewis Mertz, who died at Antietam and was buried by Union troops near the small church. There's a short list of Jews in that company and included one name that stood out in my mind, and I sounded somehow familiar. Anselm Stern. Of course, Anselm is a German name, and Stern, S-T-E-R-N-E. Finally, it's a little unusual. I've not seen it during the era, reading through the lists of Civil War and other Jews. Where had I seen it before? Maybe in Athens, Georgia, but I checked and the answer came and it was not. And I found out when I finished my last leg of the journey on my sabbatical studies back in the pulpit in Anniston, Alabama, where I served for about 15 years doing part-time rabbiing. It was a wedding of former congregants his family had known for 3 generations. And there it was, in the foyer of Temple Beth El in Anniston, Alabama, was the founding stone built into the wall. Anselm Stern had come from Germany to West Point, Georgia, which is on the Alabama border, and moved to Anniston after the war for business and was a key founder of the synagogue. The synagogue was the town's second oldest house of worship after the Episcopal Church. And I had a picture of that stone taken. I don't have that handy, but I may have a picture of the synagogue in Anniston, which is a beautiful structure. I'm going to see if I can pull that out after we. So just to recap, in the first session, we had an overview of Jewish lives, accomplishments, and roles during the Civil War. And in the last session, we focused on religious life and observances during the war, and detailed the chaplaincy controversy. And tonight we looked at a few portraits of the era, personalities, mostly Southern. And that is a look at the experiences of Jews and Jewish personality profiles from a Southern emphasis during the Civil War. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Just unmute if you have a question, John.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. One of the more intriguing characters to me, and of course I do have the Rosen book, was Simon Baruch, who of course is Bernard Baruch's father. I think he immigrated from Prussia to escape conscription into the Prussian army, but then he volunteered. I don't know how he became a medical student, but he was learning surgery on the fly, literally, under tutelage with South Carolina units. And I think he was captured and exchanged 3 times. And the most interesting 2 things I remember reading about him, one was he wrote a long letter to the medical department of the Confederacy saying that having experienced working with the Sanitary Commission, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, because he wrote a story that basically after he was working with the wounded after Gettysburg and the Sanitary Commission showed up, and instead of putting handcuffs on him and said, here's a driver and a wagon, go draw supplies. So they drove him over to get more medical supplies. And for the next 3 days, he worked on the wounded. And then after that was done, of course, then they finally arrested and confined him. But he wrote a long letter to the medical department saying, we need to organize like they are. He says, they're better at it than we are. They're more effective at gathering casualties and treating them. And we need something similar. The other little tidbit about him, and I read a little bit of Bernard Baruch's autobiography, that he remembered after they moved to New York after the war, every time Simon Baruch heard a band strike up Dixie, he would cut loose with the rebel yell. Very intriguing character, to say the least.
Yeah, there are many, many others, yes.
And the other thing about Judah Benjamin, and I'm just remembering this, is that apparently, of course, you alluded to his later career in England. where he rose to be Queen's Counsel or, at the time.
Oh, yeah.
At the top of the very list. I think his book on contracts is still used by the British judiciary. It's like in its fourth printing, Benjamin on Contracts, because I've seen the cover piece.
He was an expert on contract and maritime law.
Uh-huh.
And his earlier life, before his political life, business and his legal accomplishments were very interesting, very much so.
Rabbi, what was it like for the Jews in the North? It seems like all of the
Well,
research
first of all, you got to know that the entire North was not united on the Civil War. There were some who felt they shouldn't have invaded the South, even though the South seceded. Others were abolitionists and they were rabid. There were not a lot of Jewish abolitionists. Abolitionists tended to incorporate a lot of Christian fundamentalism, and it was anti-Semitic. So you didn't see a lot. And yet there was the rabbi from Baltimore who was in the abolitionist cause. Isaac Mayer Wise was not. So again, there's no single simple answer. Some in New York, for example, there was a lot of pacifist sentiment, a lot of pacifists, and there was even some riots. They didn't want to have to be subject to the draft, and so there was not a. It's important to see nuance, not to think that this is a black and white, all or nothing kind of situation. So it's hard to say. There many enlisted in large numbers. Many were drafted. Of course, they had a draft where if you had enough money, you could pay someone to take your place. They did that then. Now they do that, but it's a little more illegal, a little more subtle. But yeah, so I mean, I really don't have a handle on what was it like. There were more Jews coming, but not like today. They had congregations in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, of course, Baltimore, and Newport, Rhode Island, and Pittsburgh, but they were small. They were smaller, just as I'm sure Avad Chesed, when it was founded, wasn't founded with 300 Jewish families. It was probably founded with someone. I ought to sit down and read the history of Jacksonville Jewry in my moments. But it starts small as a community, a couple of prominent people, a couple of soldiers, a couple of artists, what have you, and then it grows over the course of time. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, if that's what you were looking for. Does that address it, or is there?
I was just wondering because it seems like there was more information on the Jews in the South.
Yes.
Than there was in the North. So
yes.
As an aside, the Jewish synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, I don't know if I mentioned it before or not, was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And
yes, you did. I remember that. Yes, and of course the reason for that was deliberate, because frankly, there weren't surgeon generals, there weren't quartermaster generals, there weren't secretaries of war and secretaries of state in the North, but they were in the South, which is not to say that there weren't high-ranking Jewish officers, a couple of generals, but they didn't have the role either in the social context or in the military or in the political that they did in the South. I mean, think about it. Jefferson Davis and Judah Benjamin, a Jewish senator, a person of Jewish background, certainly, I don't know how to define his Jewishness. And then there was David Yulee from Florida. Again, he never claimed to be Jewish, but his background is. You don't see that in the North.
Oh, hold on.
So, Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
Are there any figures as to the percentage of Jewish soldiers in both the North and the South? I know it's hard to probably pin them down at that time as is today. But give us some kind of an
Well,
idea.
if you recall, and numbers are my weakness, I like to tell my congregations, I did very well in rabbinic studies and Bible, but I got all the verses right and all the ideas right, but sometimes I'd mix it up, whether it was Genesis 3:2 or 2:3. But humor aside, you remember the conversation about Mark Twain's remark that he never saw a fighting Jew. And yet Rosen in his book, and maybe John has that at his fingertips, said the numbers of Jews who fought and died were very high, 5%, 10%, something like that. So there was a very strong Jewish response on both sides in the war.
Okay, thank you.
We can look that up. If somebody has a Google, I can't do it because I'm talking.
Jack has his hand up.
Jack,
You have to unmute Jack.
Jack,
So,
you have to
all right,
unmute Jack.
he's got it.
There we go. We're having some technical problems. We can't hear you, Jack.
Let me see.
We can't hear you, Jack. We're not able to understand what you're saying. Ellen, does
I'm
Jack
sending
have his
a
cell
message.
phone? Could he call in his question?
I don't know.
Jack, can you hear me? Wave if you can hear me. Good.
Could
You have
write
your
it.
cell phone. We're not able to hear you. It's coming across kind of jumbled. Do you have your cell phone handy?
He could just write it in the chat.
Yeah, that was a
Ah,
good idea.
okay, what a great idea.
Can you do that, Jack?
Oh, poor Jack.
Yeah, I think the speed is wrong.
Very, too bad.
Let's see if you can write something in chat. Yeah, there's something with the speed.
Hmm.
There we go. You see it, Rabbi? It says the only war cemetery outside of Israel, I'm going to mute that, is in Richmond, Virginia.
I'm not sure I understand
the
it.
question? I'm gonna
John,
ask
can you?
Yeah, hold on. I asked him, what is the question? Here, he's typing. It was a statement
Oh, okay.
stating that the only war cemetery outside of Israel is in Richmond, Virginia.
Well, the only war, you mean military? I'm not sure what you mean by the war cemetery. I mean, we had one in Hagerstown. We had a memorial, Confederate memorial cemetery, national cemeteries. I'm not clear.
John.
Rabbi, I do remember, of course, I think I mentioned before that there was at least a Magen David on the gate out at Old Blandford Church out at Petersburg, which they may have made a Jewish section. I don't know all the facts on that
that's
one.
right.
But there are other Jewish military burials in Richmond because I think there were either one or two synagogues there, Shaco and one other.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jack just wrote Jewish War Memorial Cemetery.
Okay. Possible.
He believes the only war cemetery, Jewish War Memorial Cemetery, is in Richmond, Virginia, outside of Israel.
One of the biggest.
The book I mentioned, and it's in the the bibliography that I think we distributed, we can distribute it again, was Mel Young, Y-O-U-N-G. He wrote a book, Where They Lie, Someone Should Say Kaddish. It was written in 1991, and he documents, that would answer your earlier question about how many Jews died, and he lays out the number of Jews who, yeah, that's right, Ellen,
The
you're
author,
right.
what's the book
Mel
title?
Young, yeah, Where
What's the
They
title?
Lie, someone should say Kaddish. And he lays out in very detailed specifics, to the extent that's possibly known, but with some sense of accuracy, the number of Jews who fought and died at Petersburg, at this campaign, at Antietam, at the Valley campaign, on both sides. So that would be an interesting kind of follow-up, particularly if you're doing research and you need primary sources like gravestones, cemetery records, and so on. But that answers the question that you raised a little earlier, how many Jews actually fought and how many died on both sides. And he really lays that out in detail.
I think the accepted overall percentage, at least what I've read, and this number changes, they were saying of the 3 million total engaged on both sides, if you add those numbers together, they're looking at 20% casualty rate, which is horrific by any standard. But I've been told a couple of times that that number keeps creeping up depending on whose statistics you're relying on. It's
And
more
where
like
they were, yeah, and which battles and where they were. And so there's lots. And then again, Jews were part of all groups. There wasn't a particular Jewish regiment, or even one, but
correct.
Right.
talked about. But yeah, that's accurate. Wonderful. Well, does anybody have any questions generally about this whole period, Jews in it? I mean, it's a fascinating, complex, nuanced story. And you pointed out Baruch, Bernard Baruch's father, Simon Baruch, is an interesting. There are many, many, many others, but you know, there's only so much time. And then I guess the question I would leave with you is, so what do we learn from this? What do we learn from this period, from Jews who were involved on both sides? Is there any message or lesson for us today?
They could participate. Yes.
That's a good one. Why don't you say that?
Well, the thing that occurred to me, Rabbi,
Yeah.
of course, and I think, and I appreciate you using the word nuance because that's something you don't always hear. But the idea that these largely immigrant peoples, who were, and some of whom were recent immigrants, by the way, you touched on the 1848 revolutions.
Right.
They not only chose to participate, either North or South, but they were allowed to, even with some backpush on. But by and large, they felt they could do it. They were allowed to, and it was an accepted thing in a general sense. That yes, we can. We're American citizens. We're members of our states, and we're going to participate. And why shouldn't we?
Right. Whereas in Europe, that was not the case. A Jew could not be in the German or the French or the Russian army, whatever, depending on the period, of course. Yes. And the one lesson, let me throw this out here. Maybe we can get a spark or two flying. I hope not. But the fact is, the parallel you might see is that in one way, it's like today. We have Jews on both sides politically. We have Jews both sides on Black Lives Matters. We have Jews on both sides of almost every issue today, which wasn't true 50 or 60 years ago. So maybe that's some of the messages, how the New York Jewish community sent matzah during the war to the Jews in, what was it, Charleston, that were starving. And you know, after the war, and how they would help each other and reconstruct synagogues and send prayer books. maybe there's a lesson for us to take from, perhaps. Because these are also very times of great division and great conflict of a different sort. Is that analogy in a small way? Nothing's exactly the same. Interesting.
I thought it
Don,
was
you have a
very
hand up?
interesting that, oh, excuse me. I was going to say, I thought it was very interesting that the Jews were so involved. I didn't really know anything about the Jews in the Civil War. So this was really interesting to learn about it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's, as I think I said earlier on, when I mentioned it to a couple of Jewish people, but also to a minister friend of mine. And he said, well, you know, I never even would have thought of that about Civil War and Jews. And I said, of course not, because our minds are compartmentalized. Judaism is here, and Holocaust and Hanukkah and Torah and Civil War and Grant and Lee, that's over here. And we don't make those, we don't ask that question unless you ask the question. You know, I think if they were writing, I don't want to put words in the author long since gone's mouth, but if she were writing it today, Gone with the Wind, I would have had at least one Southern Jewish figure in there, you know, because that's probably reality, at least in passing. But again, when that was written and when the movies were made, that's the last thing on earth you would do. You would hide people's Jewish identity. You would, you know, Tony Curtis and Piper Laurie, you know, you've had that program, I'm sure. And they all had Jewish names. They had to change their names. They had to appear to be, and the studios were owned by most by Jews. So you had to play that down. You certainly didn't call attention to it, but that's sure different from today, isn't it? Thank goodness. Very much so. 37, is it? 37 congressmen and senators are Jews? Did I read that? Is that accurate? Now?
We can look that up too.
Yeah, but again, these are, you start over here and you talk about some patterns. And this is true in a lot of Jewish ideas and history. And it raises other questions, and it kind of makes you question or connect some of the dots, though not all are connectable. Sure.
Okay, very good.
Well, does anybody have any other points or questions? Maybe down the road, I'll put together a short session for wisdom or something else on Judah Benjamin. You know, just kind of deal with that. That might be an interesting, because he is quite an interesting person. Many things I hadn't even read about, because everything I studied was the political period, the legal, and the Confederacy, and so on. And yet, he's a very interesting person, a very interesting time, a very interesting life.
Mhm.
But I thank you for attending. I know it's been a lot of other stuff going on today, and that's how it is. Sometimes we have a lot of stuff on the table, but I thank you very much, and I've enjoyed doing this and seeing you. And
Thank you,
we'll
Rabbi.
be seeing you down the road. Thank you
Thank you,
very
Rabbi.
much.
Very good.
I'll stay
Bye.
safe.
Okay,
be
you
well.
too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Nice to see you.
If anybody wants to chat, I'll leave this open for a bit. You can certainly chat with one another.
Yeah, there you go.
Hello?
Yes, David.
Everybody gone?
No,
No,
Jack,
there's-
Sophia, and Rabbi are still there.
Oh. Rabbi, did you get your shots?
Yes, I have one. I have a shot. Yes,
Good.
yes. More and more people are, so it's starting to put together. What do we have there? South side, Jack,
Huh?
Jack has one there.
I've had 2 shots and a week into the hole, so I got 1 more week and I'll be 95%. 95% COVID free.
Wonderful. Well,
Yeah.
we certainly are a lot more hopeful now than we were 3, 4, 5 months ago. So
Well, they're adding a lot more sites. Winn-Dixie is about to throw in the sponge, and I heard even Walgreens and CVS might be doing something. But with Winn-Dixie,
Right.
you have to check on which Winn-Dixie because the one in Mandarin doesn't have a pharmacy.
well, again, in every case, you have to follow up with the details, but I've been reading a lot about these variants and the concern about that. But they're going to have, and they're working on, and it's not far away, even for these Modernas and Pfizers, they're going to have booster shots. So I'm not worried whatsoever. And the new versions that come out this summer will already have that capability of dealing with that. And I believe, and again, please don't report me to the Florida Medical Board for practicing without a license. I'm not. I'm just telling you my opinion on stuff. But I do believe that moving forward, we will see annual booster shots, just like we do with the flu.
Okay,
no one
but that
thinks
will be
twice
in a
about it.
year. But that will be next year, right? That booster.
Yeah, and the year after, just
Like
like
we
we
had,
get a
let's
flu
say-
shot every year, we'll get a
Right.
booster shot.
It's the
So,
same thing as the flu shot.
exactly. But again, don't report me
Right.
to the government. They won't like it.
But the one thing about the flu shot, you can go to your doctor and get it. I don't know. I'm
And-
hoping that the booster shots will be given by your doctor.
Well,
It
It
won't
is
be a
different
hassle.
because there is always a shortage. So they did not give to even pharmacies around. It is only in special sites that have and also government is paying. So special places where they have a special, some kind of a
storage,
right.
deep
not-
freeze storage, yeah.
not just storage, but they do have a special between them. There is I
Yeah,
am missing the
But
word.
maybe the booster won't need that storage.
Right.
We don't know. We'll have to see.
We don't know anything. Right now, I'm happy to have 2 shots in a week in the hole. And
There
I'm
you
not
go.
worried about the booster down the pike.
Right.
You have to just take one step at a time. Meanwhile, they're fighting for the first shot all over the country. But at least we're capable. If you get the first shot, they have a reserve for you to get the second shot in Florida. I know in Florida that's true.
Well, that makes sense. Folks, I need to leave. I want to thank you again and enjoy it. Look
Thank
forward to
you.
seeing you again.
Thank you.
Be well.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
Wendy, we're all gone. We're wrapping it up.
Bye-bye.
Why, thank you, David.
You're quite welcome. You're quite
Wendy, we're
welcome.
closing
Bye-bye.
the room.
Bye-bye.